Hi there. My name is Richard Kirkcrummett, and I'm an archivist, and I research a lot on record labels, local groups, rhythm and blues, jazz, you name it, anything to do with the 40s and 50s music. Until I hit Derby Records. Derby Records started in May of 1949, just before the Kentucky Derby. But I didn't know that a few weeks ago. A few weeks ago, I was looking at a piece of literature. Well, actually, it was from a booklet from a UK double CD set that gave me the information that Derby Records started in July of 1949. Well, then I found out the first two releases were released in June, and I said to myself, well, how could that be? How could you release two records and not have the record label established by that time? So I went back and I figured out that it was in May, on a Thursday, 5th of May, that Derby Records was established as a business. And you think it would stop right there. But no, it kept going and going and going. The contracts that Derby Records would put out between Eddie Heller, who was actually the owner of Rainbow Records, and then Larry Newton, who was the owner of Derby Records, would sign people, and they wouldn't stay that long. The only one that really stayed for at least half of the label's duration, which was from 49 to 1954, when they filed for bankruptcy on October 15th. And of course, that was on a Thursday. In which most of those masters were sold to RCA Victor. RCA Victor then re-released some of these, not everything. They re-released some of these and sold others to other different labels. And the tracing down, because they would change the names of the artists sometimes to something else. Some of the information that was given into this little booklet made me stop and had to go back on the actual trade papers to find any information on this label. Not so much the groups and who was in these groups and who was the musicians and everything. I mean, I'm going to do that as well. But the switch from being a specialized jazz, rhythm, and blues label to a pop-ish label coming around 1952 with the advent of a song by Sonny Gale and Eddie Wilcox, which was a huge success, called Wheel of Fortune. The record was huge, but it was much larger. It was much larger than the other two that they had previous. One was by Jimmy Preston called Oh Babe, and the other one was Larry Doby's Boogie. Larry Doby was a black baseball player for the Cleveland Indians. And that record, Doby's Boogie, actually put Derby Records on the map. And then Oh Babe gave it another kick. But it was Wheel of Fortune that really did some sales damage. And after Wheel of Fortune came out, the label changed its sound from a specialty rhythm and blues label to a pop label. You had all these pop artists come in, and you still had some rhythm and blues playing, but my take is they were trying to be an all-around label. Well, they had no idea, or they did have an idea. It was actually turning off the rhythm and blues market, and that was one of their mainstays for about 2 years. I don't know what exactly happened that the label went out of business, but I do know that there were other people involved that tried to keep it afloat, but the label was having problems with staff. They were having problems with frivolous contracts. They were having problems with distribution, such as Dobie's Boogie didn't hit on the West Coast, but got as far as Minnesota. They got as far as St. Louis. It didn't get further than that. It was mainly an East United States hit. And it would have been a substantial hit if it had been distributed on the West Coast. This was where Larry Newton would go out, what they call into the field, and get his ducks in a row with all the distributions that were going on. There were also other side labels that occurred with this label. One of them I'm discovering was the Anchor label was associated with Derby Records. Now, Anchor Records put out country, so it answers the country end of it. And then in 53, Central Records was started. And that lasted not as long as the main label, but it lasted for a little bit. But it seems to be mind-boggling putting it all back together in a complete discography. And at first, and this is just from my studies, as you can see here, they had a little problem with the label's identification. One of the artists that they contracted or signed was Lawrence 88 Keys. Well, it's spelled Keys, but his actual last name was Keyes. Now, he had a sound very, very similar to Nat King Cole, and I had a feeling that getting Lawrence Keys in was going to corner that market. But Lawrence Keys did not stay with the label. In fact, he left, leaving eight masters behind. 2 of those masters was later issued in a different name. But it was Lawrence Keys that that did it. It was a song called Donkey Boogie, and it was by an artist by something Jackson, and it was a Lawrence 88 Keys session. Another one that really gets me is Henry. There's a Henry. Frank Humphreys, also known as Fat Man or Frank Fat Man Humphreys, came to the label and made 8 sides, recorded 8 sides. And 2 sides were supposed to be released, and then they were canned. Well, the reason why they were canned is because Frank left to go to Abbey Records. So they didn't use any of those masters, and they kept it in the can. There were supposed to be 2 releases. There were supposed to be 2 releases of Lawrence 88 Keys, but the first release that they had set up for Derby Records, and I was just going here because it's all on my system. You got to excuse me because I got to turn my head for just a minute here to go to Derby Records. Occurred number 719, which was never found out to be an issue at all, but it was slated to be Lawrence 88 Keys, I'll Always Be in Love with You. In my research, I found this out, but it remained unissued until I traced down some of these budget records, and I found it. I found the unissued ones of Lawrence 88 Keys. I found the one that they did issue, which was Derby, Derby 722, and 722 was That Lucky Old Sun. Of course, there was a big hit at that time with Frankie Lane having that song. So Billboard was reporting it as an alternative. In fact, there were like 8 or 10 different alternatives to That Lucky Old Sun, and it just happened to be in the mix. And that lasted for a while, and I don't know if any sales came from it. I imagine that they had it put in there to try to boost sales. I imagine there were others that weren't being reported, but the record didn't sell that well. When it came to Freddie Mitchell's follow-up, which was a Christmas record, I was listening to, a friend had me record a radio show, and it was WHUR, and it was a specialty Christmas show. One of the songs in the Christmas show happened to have been Jingle Bell Boogie. And the guy who's narrating it, one of the people that were narrating it, had the whole musician staff down, right to the drummer. And I'm running to get my pen and writing these things down. And I realized it's going too fast. And then I said to myself, oh, wait until it's over, because I did record it and I can go back and get the notes. So I'm contacting one of the people that was involved with that show if they have any information about Derby Records. And as you can see, my notes, look at this. These are my notes on just 2 years of Derby Records. And I haven't even finished with looking up all the cash boxes up to the beginning of 1952. Oh, and then the pics, and then the songs, and then the articles, and putting that all together, I realized, because I'm trying to put, short little 1-hour shows together about Derby Records. And it's becoming not an obsession, but getting the information right. It is just astounding. And to trace the material of this label down is also astounding. I'm being fooled sometimes, but then again, when I'm not expecting it, I get a lead. Such as there's this individual that has all these Laurie Sisters masters. Well, 4 of the masters came off of Derby Records. And an interesting note, when Derby Records ceased to exist, they stopped at issue 863. But they came out with a Laurie Sisters record with number 900, which would have put it into 1955. And I was like, well, were they trying to reboot the label? What was that? And then somewhere along the line, I realized there was a mafia connection. Oh, yeah, who knew back in those days? A mafia connection, especially with jukeboxers. There was a definite mafia connection. You think there wasn't a mafia connection with the music industry back then? Ho, ho, don't kid yourself. There was a very influential what would they say? The very influential involvement with the music industry at that point. I also noted that Derby Records also got in trouble for a song that was put out not at when Jingle Bell Boogie came out, which was in November of 1949, but after Freddie Mitchell's Indiana Express came out. A lot of people flipped it over because the flip side, Pony Express, was the real rocker of that label. But no, it was another issue, and I'm trying to figure out what it is. Yeah, came out around April or March of 1950, was Easter Boogie. Oh my goodness, the publishers of of Irving Berlin got a hold of probably Larry Newton and said, "Hey, you mind just as a courtesy, put Irving Berlin's name and change the title because that's Easter Parade." Oh, and I'm not talking about "Get Out of the Car" by the Treniers. It was the label got in trouble, not once, but twice. They came out with another one called "Summertime Boogie." Oh. So, with those two hand in hand almost, the industry, meaning ASCAP, BMI, and RIAA, were fixing to file a petition to make hard copy records that had the music on it, subject to copyright because of the material that was on it. And I'm sure later on down the line it did, because we know that nowadays is you can't publish anything unless you have a submission to who owns the rights to a song. We know all about that. The changes and everything and the reviews, people that were reviewing this label just couldn't keep up with it, and they were getting a headache because they're between 1951, well, between 50 and 51, there was just an onslaught of records being released. And jukeboxers couldn't keep up with it, nor could the people that were reviewing the records keep up with it. It wasn't until "Oh Babe" by Jimmy Preston came out that, the label started getting more established. But it wasn't until the Eddie Wilcox and the Sonny Gale "Wheel of Fortune" came out that really blew the sky open. Anyway, that's just the beginning of my research. And all I wanted to do was do a couple of Derby story shows for the radio, and that's where I'm at. So this might seem to be like a little a vlog or something, but it has been an adventure and has been a headache. Thus, I have my headache pills right here to prove it. To get this label right. And I'm finding that other people were involved, such as Bunny Paul of Essex Records, signed a contract with Derby Records. But she didn't stay with Derby Records. She went with Dot Records. So my guess is the stability in the distribution wasn't all that good with Derby, and so Dot signed her up. And when Dot released her first two sides, Essex came in and bought out her contract. Now, what's significant with that is the Harptones were originally a backup group for Essex Records. And they came as being borrowed from, and you see what's going on here? The tie-ins with other things. This is what happened with Derby Records. And then I had people that advised me, well, you shouldn't bother with it because, it's a label not to worry about. It's a label not to even bother with. Oh, you had Bomb Ferguson on there, D.C., Washington, D.C., Bomb Ferguson. You had champion Jack Dupree on the label. You had Bobby Mitchell, was Bob Mitchell, on the label. You had Eunice Davis, who had thought she had something and she left the label and went to Atlantic. And so many other artists that came through and said, basically, screw this. But, the frivolous contracts and everything, just, you couldn't keep up with it. And some of them were tricks of the trades. Some of them were standards. Of course, of course the blacks got ripped off. That was another thing that was more of a common practice in those days. And it's not pretty, but these things happen. These were still the Jim Crow days. And the civil rights thing had not begun to cook up just yet. And people took advantage. I mean, look at the Chess Brothers. They did the same thing. They took advantage of their artists too. And their artists didn't know better, but they liked the fact that they were on record, and what money they did get was mainly with concerts. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. You have the opportunity, but you're not making the money that you thought you would. So with the event of two other labels plus Central Records and this Anchor Records, which I'm not sure if it's a direct tie. I'm still investigating that. For the country side of the label, that's where I'm at with it right now. I'm at the beginning of 1952, where all of that changes with the label. And until I do another little log, that's all I got. Like I say on my shows, I'll see yous.